Good morning. This is Omar Muhammad, and this is our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism. Today, we are honored to welcome the EU Commission Coordinator to Combat Anti-Semitism and Fostering Jewish Life, Katharina Schönerbein. Welcome to our podcast.
Good morning, Omar. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. We are honored to have you on our podcast. Would it be possible to introduce yourself and also your office to our audience?
Yes, my position was established in December 2015, and I was the first to hold this position, and I have it since for the 9th year now. The aim was, in the face of rising anti-Semitism since the 2000s, really, and we saw lethal attacks coming from extreme Islamism, but also from the far right, and we saw this increase of anti-Semitism in the beginning of the century, to have a comprehensive response to that. And for that, my mandate is threefold. First, to be in very close contact with the Jewish community in a constant dialogue to ensure that we get it right, and then to propose policies, to advise at the political level, and to adopt policy and implement it. So the whole cycle, and now we are in the phase of implementation of an EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life that was adopted in 2021.
It's always important to know that within the European Union there is a dedicated office to combat anti-Semitism, and this takes me to I have looked into the reports that your office releases. I think there are also reports, I don't know if they were released by your office or by other entity. They date back to probably 2000 or 2002, annual reports on the state of anti-Semitism in Europe. So the question is related to how do you see and what is your evaluation of the state of anti-Semitism in the last 2 decades?
I think if we look back, we see that anti-Semitism never went away. But after 9/11, a lot of the conspiracy myths that we saw around the events of 9/11 also hit the Jewish community. And the idea that somehow the Jews had their hands in it. And this led to a significant rise of anti-Semitic acts as well, and combined with start of the use of the internet more frequently, so these conspiracy myths could spread. And then we saw a range of anti-Semitic lethal attacks, in particular in France, for example. Ilan Halimi, a young teenager, was held hostage and killed in the end in 2006. In 2012, there was an attack on a Jewish school in Toulouse, which was lethal. And, so we saw several attacks, then also the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels and the synagogue in Denmark. So that led to the acknowledgement that what the Jews had been requesting, namely to have a concerted reply to that and policy across Europe was needed. In 2004, I believe, yes, the European Commission held its first conference on combating anti-Semitism, and that was with Elie Wiesel at the time. And I reread his speech that he gave back then, and it is as if he would hold it today, including saying, if the Jews tell you they live in fear, believe them and act. And, so what we see today and what we have seen since the 7th of October has a lot to do with what we saw in the beginning of the 2000s. And the Commission subsequently then acted with regards to anti-Semitism. We started an EU-Israel seminar on anti-Semitism in 2005. This takes place usually once a year, either in Jerusalem or in Brussels. And it led in 2015 after some other smaller steps. But also, for example, one was to, in 2012, poll the situation of Jews in Europe, to hold a survey among the Jewish community as to their perception and experience on anti-Semitism, which we have repeated in 2018 and also will come out with the third edition this year. And then in 2015, the office with subsequently the strategy. And now what our aim is really is to establish structures across Europe so that on a member state level, on this level of regions, of cities, and of course on the European level, we not only react to anti-Semitism, but we also can prevent it.
Looking at this same data and the statistics that you have been gathering, where do you see there is more anti-Semitism within the European countries? Other countries have less, other countries have similar statistics. And we will get later to why when we discuss the narratives. But where do you see the concern is more directed? In which countries, if you can name them?
Well, I think it's a complicated question because, first of all, you don't need Jews for anti-Semitism. Conspiracy myths, anti-Semitic conspiracy myths can develop even without Jews. So in some countries, we have high levels of prejudice, despite the fact that the Jewish community is very small. In other countries, we have small communities, and yet there is hostility towards them. And then you have big countries, in particular in Western Europe, where we have seen a significant rise also with regards to attacks and like in France, really difficulties also between, for example, the Muslim community and the Jewish community. The two murders that we saw of individuals in their homes, one of them even being a Holocaust survivor, by extremists calling Allahu Akbar when they did the deed. Yeah. So we have a wide range. But I think what is important is to see that the pockets of society where it comes from are extremist ones on the one side. So we have right-wing extremism, we have Islamist extremism, which are both very violent or can be violent. We have left-wing anti-Semitism, which is less violent but can be very toxic for society. And then we have the middle of society that either is silent or takes in some of the thinking that comes from the fringes and perpetuates a certain form of anti-Semitism, which is not necessarily violent, but still very harmful. We see that a lot on the internet, yeah. The lawful but awful things that are not necessarily hate speech, but still create an atmosphere in which is not pleasant for Jews.
So how do you see the current state of anti-Semitism in Europe? Anything changed?
Well, I think there will be forever a time before the 7th of October and after. Yeah. At the heart of the EU strategy on combating anti-Semitism and fostering Jewish life, which is already in the title, is the aspect of fostering Jewish life, of creating a framework in which Jewish life can flourish, we even say it as part of our strategy, Europe can only flourish if Jewish life can flourish too. So this aspect was central, and I think there was a lot of improvement before 7th of October with regards to creating alliances with the climate action, with between Muslims and Jews and other religions, with the LGBTI community. Within civil society, there was a lot of very positive aspects happening. This has all ceased since the 7th of October. Now we see that the Jews feel left alone, and that, they hide as a consequence their identity, even, for example, at the workplace or in school, simply to avoid being attacked. And we have seen, for example, maybe not as far-reaching as in the United States, but certainly also in the level of universities, a significant rise of anti-Semitic incidents, hostility towards Jews not being given the right to voice their opinion, or having to denounce their identity by having to renounce Zionism, for example, before they can join a student union. We've seen also violent attacks. In Berlin, there was an attack on Jewish students by another student from the same university, just simply because he sided with Israel and called for the release of hostages. And the Jewish student had to go to hospital. I think what we see now is that with regards to the situation, it's difficult, but key is, what is the reaction? Do the competent authorities react quickly? Do they acknowledge the anti-Semitic bias in an incident, or the hate crime, if it is so? Yeah, so I think what is very important is this first aspect of saying, okay, maybe whether it is illegal or not is sometimes difficult to judge, but we have a definition which makes it very clear when an incident is anti-Semitic. Of course, it always is related to context and so on, but still, this is important, and that definition helps us to identify the anti-Semitic bias. And so the quickness of reaction is key for the victim to feel that the incident is acknowledged from their perspective. And that is, this victim-based approach is what we have in all other forms of discrimination as well. And I think we need to understand what it means for the Jewish community.
Which takes me to a question I forgot to ask in the beginning, which is actually a very important question, because definitions are fundamental to tackling any problem, but also to finding solutions. What is the definition of anti-Semitism? And this is a question that gets asked by many people. My students have asked me this question. Others have been asking me this question. And I made it sure that whenever I meet a coordinator on combating anti-Semitism or offices working on combating anti-Semitism, that we make it clear that there is a definition on which you build your strategy.
Yes. So with regards to our work, we have based it on the so-called IRA definition. So the definition by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance that was adopted in 2016, however, dates back to 2005, where in that time that I mentioned in the beginning, we saw anti-Semitism already on the rise. It was developed in cooperation with Jewish representatives, and in particular, it holds different examples. So the definition itself is anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jews or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. So this is the definition in a nutshell. But what is important is the 11 examples that then give forms of contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, in the media, in schools, in the workplace, also in the religious sphere. And that is, for example, obviously, then, and that goes without saying, but still it is said, justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology, which is something that we saw on European streets when they were celebrating on the 7th of October the deeds by Hamas. So this was before there was any reaction from Israel in Gaza. It was on the day itself, and it celebrated and justified the killing of Jews, and the most violent and highest number of Jews having been killed on one single day since the Shoah. Then there is another example, which is making dehumanizing or demonizing stereotypical allegations about Jews. For example, that they have power to reign the world, or that they control the media, they control the banks, the governments. This is a dangerous form of conspiracy, because if you believe this, then your belief in, or your trust in democratic processes and in elections is very low. So it is, on the one side, unacceptable towards the Jewish community, but it has also this other effect of being dangerous for democracy. Then there is the aspect of Holocaust denial, which is criminalized in Europe, and which we have in the past years also implemented in the sense that European legislation has been there since 2008, but it needed proper translation into European legislation. And then linked to that is also accusing Israel or the Jews of exaggerating or inventing the Holocaust. There is another aspect to that, which is linked to saying to trivializing the Holocaust by making false comparisons. So you have all these aspects that are related to it, and then there is a whole aspect with regards to the state of Israel and Israel-related anti-Semitism, which is one of the forms that we see currently very significantly. So, for example, to deny the Jewish people the right to self-determination by saying that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. So, in itself, it is racist to have that state of Israel, by applying double standards with regards to Israel, requiring of Israel behavior that he would not expect from other democratic nations. Also using classical anti-Semitic images, for example, from Nazi times, to characterize Israel or Israelis. And then drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, which is something that we have also seen as a lot recently. And what is the impact on the Jewish community here in Europe is the last example, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. So why should Jews that live in Europe, Europeans, face this increase of anti-Semitism here? They have not changed their behavior. So this link is always there, has always been there. We've seen that in the Intifadas, that it led to spikes of anti-Semitic content and incidents here. But now we have seen it even more in a more drastic way. And if you allow me to finish this aspect, because with regards to the definition, because I know it's been a bit long, but it's important to know also, because often we are accused of saying, you limit the freedom of speech when it comes to Israel and the criticism of Israel, which is not true, because in the very beginning, the definition says that criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded anti-Semitic. So if you accuse Israel of something that you could accuse others of, with regards, for example, to the government or also the occupation, other things, that cannot be considered anti-Semitic. And then two other aspects. One is that whether an anti-Semitic incident is criminal is defined by law. So we don't change the law. We cannot limit freedom of speech in that sense. And context matters. So, something sprayed on a synagogue, maybe something may be anti-Semitic, while it being sprayed on a bridge is not necessarily anti-Semitic. So it depends on the context. In that sense, this definition is comprehensive, but it's very useful. It can be used for training, for teachers, for law enforcement, and it is being used here in Europe in this context. And we have seen that it really changes also the behavior and the quickness of behavior, as I said before.
That's why it's important to have a definition, but also sometimes it's also to simplify the definition to the younger generation. Because if I take you back to October 7th, the day itself, and then what came later, how do you, I believe there was also a pressure on your office, on all the offices of combating anti-Semitism, because it's a type of unprecedented level of violence explicitly directed at Jews for being Jews, civilians getting killed, sexual violence, kidnapping, and beside all of that, it was widely celebrated around the world.
Yeah.
How did you see the change? What are the challenges that you face when dealing with such an unprecedented anti-Semitism that's associated also with violence?
Yeah. No, we have seen, unfortunately, violence also here in Europe. Violence directed against Jews, violence directed against synagogues, and that radicalization that became obvious on the 7th of October among those that celebrated the deeds of Hamas has then also played out, for example, by demonstrations calling for the establishment of a caliphate. We saw one in Malmö, another one in Copenhagen. Yeah, so that clearly goes against democracy, against our values. And I think this is what we need to understand, that fighting anti-Semitism means also fighting for democracy, fighting for a diverse society. Jews can thrive in a society where minorities can thrive. And one of the reasons why Europe was created was to say what happened in the Second World War, that we went against minorities for what they were, above all the Jews, but also Roma, also LGBTIQ persons and others. Yeah, so that we went for people for their identity. This will never happen again. And as we see Jewish life being under pressure at the moment, we also have to ask that question: what do we need to do in order to safeguard, above all, the Jews? Obviously, so we had to increase security. We have also made money available to make sure that Jewish premises, Jewish communities can install the necessary security. We've called on member states to do this because it's the number one responsibility of the nation state to ensure the security of their citizens. this is one aspect, but I think it's much wider. We have to also make sure that Jews can live their identity in public and don't have to hide it. And at the moment, what we see is that Jews rather hide their Star of David if they wear one, or that they put the mezuzah from the outside of the door inside the door, so the little box with the scripture in it, or that Jewish newspapers have started to send out their copies no longer in see-through plastic, but in white neutral envelopes. So these kind of things to, Jews saying that when I take a taxi, I get off 2 streets early and I walk home because I don't want anybody to know where I live. And so this, I think, is something that is very dangerous, and what we have tried to tackle, first of all, by clearly siding with the Jewish community. I personally went also to the demonstration and spoke at the demonstration that took place here against anti-Semitism in Brussels. To be visible, President von der Leyen lit the big Hanukkah in the heart of the European quarter in last December, to visit synagogues, which we also did, and Vice President Skinas of the European Commission went to several synagogues, Vice President Jourova, myself, and so we really made sure that the Jewish communities also see that we are with them. And then, in the wider sense of addressing polarization, we adopted a communication on the 6th of December, which on the one side says governments have an obligation to avoid polarization, but also civil society actors. And so we are now in the process of bringing representative samples, let's say, of citizens from across Europe together to discuss this question of how to overcome hatred and polarization, how to recreate some of the alliances. And that is what is happening at the moment. We'll have another one of those next weekend. And so they're live streamed, and it's something that hopefully can be an inspiration to those who go back into their countries and then multiply these ideas.
In one of the episodes we recorded on Poland, and the speaker mentioned something related to the source of influence on anti-Semitism in Europe, and it was mentioned that, for example, in Poland, and not limited to Poland, but for example, there was also the influence of the American right wing on anti-Semitism in Europe. Do you see that type of influence that comes from outside Europe?
Yes. So we have not only far right or right wing extremist influence from the US, which we clearly see, for example, in the QAnon movement and the white supremacist ideas, in the Great Replacement ideas, conspiracy myths. But we also have seen influence, for example, from Russia with regards to distortion of the Holocaust or trivialization of the Holocaust, because they know that this is something to which Europe is very sensitive. We had an incident also where in Berlin, there were the Stars of David spray painted on some houses where Jews lived. And shortly after, in Paris, a big neighborhood spray painted with these Stars of David. And when they investigated it, while probably the Berlin spray painting was more local, this here led to sources in Moldova. So, this is definitely something that we are monitoring, in particular also online, with regards, again, wider than the Jewish community, and in particular with regards to the European elections that are happening in June, and making sure that there isn't that disinformation and false facts are being dismantled. There's colleagues working specifically on these aspects, including also anti-Semitic content that comes into the EU. And what we are creating now, and this is also after 7th of October, is a network of organizations, of trusted flaggers and fact-checkers in all EU languages and also non-EU languages that transport anti-Semitic content into the EU to recognize and be able to discern whether anti-Semitic speech is hate speech, therefore needs to be flagged and needs to be taken down according to European legislation, but also content that might be legal in itself, but still dangerous and needs counter speech. So this is something that we are developing as a reaction also to 7th of October and the tsunami of anti-Semitic content online that we have seen.
The United States, especially the White House, published its paper, The Strategy on Antisemitism. What is the European approach when it comes to combating anti-Semitism? Do you focus on prevention, education? You mentioned that you also work with civil society, but in the short term and also in the long-term strategy.
So I had the honor to visit and speak to White House staff before the US strategy was adopted to explain how Europe had developed the strategy and how we are implementing it. And I believe that in that sense, there are many aspects that overlap. First is the creation of structures. So when there is an anti-Semitic incident, the system needs to react. It cannot be the responsibility of one person or of a special envoy or something, but really it's clear law enforcement, civil society, a school, a university, they all have to react. So this building of structures has been key in the last years, and that's why we have requested as part of our strategy that all EU countries have their own national strategies. And as to date, 20 have adopted their national strategies and they're implementing it. They have appointed special envoys and they use as the basis for their strategy also that IRA definition on anti-Semitism that I mentioned before. So this building of structures, I think, is the most important aspect to create a sustainable way of reacting to anti-Semitism. Then with regards to the preventive arm, education is important, but I think we have to acknowledge the limits of education, because what we saw on the 7th of October and the celebration of the Hamas attacks was done also by people that have gone through our education system. And we have to be honest to ourselves to say, Holocaust education in itself is not sufficient. We need to learn much more also about Jewish life originally, and we need to learn about how anti-Semitism has developed over time, how it led to the Holocaust, but what it also means again today. And then beyond this factual knowledge, which is important to understand part of it, I think what is really the game changer is empathy. If you understand what happened from an empathetic point of view with the Jews during the Holocaust, and maybe also you can draw connections, especially when it comes to people with a migrant background or asylum seekers, migrants themselves. There are a lot of overlaps with regards to Jews as a people that has traditionally had to flee and migrate over the centuries over and over again. And in fact, in Europe, there are few Jews, I think, that lived more than 2 or 3 generations in one country because there was the next anti-Semitic wave that pushed them further. Yeah, and now most recently we saw how Jews had to flee from Ukraine because of the Russian attacks, and also the the threats that came specifically also to them as a community. So that the prevention is important, but I think we need to improve our instruments, and we are looking into this as well. We have a group of all the member states plus Jewish communities that comes together twice a year to discuss what we can do in terms of improving our instruments. And then the other aspect is to prosecute, and that is true for the internet as well as for incidents that happen offline, let's say, in the real world. I think that it's important to understand that what is illegal offline is also illegal online. We have, and also the platforms have so far not invested enough energy in making sure that anti-Semitic hate speech that is illegal in Europe is actually taken down. And the European Commission, therefore, has adopted Digital Services Act legislation that requests of the platforms certain rules if they want to operate in Europe. This is that they need to take down anti-Semitism, that they need to anti-Semitic incidents, that they need to have better redress mechanisms, better transparency as to their algorithms, and that they can be fined to the end. And so addressing anti-Semitism online, but also making sure that there is prosecution online and offline is another very important aspect.
Ms. von Schönerbein, many thanks for your time and your insights.
You're welcome. Pleasure.
This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.